This is your ultimate stop for everything sports. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Should I say more? From the NFL, MLB, the NBA to MMA, it's all in here. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Listen now.
Hello, folks. Hello. Welcome to the GSMC Sports Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Shaq Scott. And, folks, do we have a show lined up for you today? Man, oh, man, has it been a great sports week and weekend. And you know you came to the right place where we got you covered. The GSMC Sports Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. Make sure, guys, you are liking, subscribing, rating, and reviewing to the GSMC Sports Podcast Show and the GSMC Podcast Network for all your podcasting needs. We got you covered from relationships to sports to business. Everything you can possibly imagine, we got you covered. But that's not why you're here. You're here because you want to talk sports. And we're going to talk sports. I got you. Oh, we got you today. Today we're going to jump into the topic of the men and women's NCAA March Madness tournament. Then we're going to get into the NBA trade deadline because, boy, was it a historic trade deadline this year. And then later on in the show, we'll talk about how the NBA trade deadline has been in the past. You know, the history of the NBA trade deadline and some of the best deals that have been made over the years. Some that you may have forgotten about and some that are pretty historic. And we'll see how those compare in reference to this most recent 2021 NBA trade deadline. But first, we got to jump into the NCAA March Madness. And we got the men and women's March Madness Mania taking place this past weekend. And boy, was I locked in, as I'm sure all of you were. It was a tournament weekend for the ages. And as we jump into the bracket, I say we start in the women's bracket. What say you? The NCAA women's bracket. You know, this past weekend was a very eventful March Madness weekend. We saw Arizona, Texas, South Carolina, Indiana, Baylor, Louisville, Stanford, and UConn all advance in the NCAA women's bracket. And some of those games were blowouts, but they all weren't. Some of those games were pretty close. And as we go through the bracket, we'll break down game by game and see how those compare. So let's start over on the Stanford and Missouri State game. So Stanford took on Missouri State this past weekend, and that one was over as soon as the girls stepped off the bus because Stanford managed to blow out Missouri State 89-62. Stanford is the number one seed, and that doesn't surprise probably anybody this past weekend that they managed to roll on over Missouri State. Then we saw Oregon take on Louisville, Oregon being the number 6 seed and Louisville being the number 2 seed. Louisville did end up pretty handedly beating Oregon 60-42. And if you remember, the reason why this Oregon team stood out, Oregon had a player on their team who shared to TikTok the NCAA weight discrepancies in the weight rooms for women's as compared to men. So I was low-key rooting for the Oregon Ducks this past weekend, hoping they got pretty far. But they ran into the Louisville Cardinals, and they put an end to their dancing days in the NCAA March Madness this past weekend. So the Ducks weren't able to move on. Louisville was able to take that matchup. But the Ducks, you know, we thank them for all that they've done for NCAA women's sports, bringing to light the discrepancies that were in the weight room. And we all know that that's not where the discrepancies stop. But they managed to put it on social media and get a huge view of what it was like in between these two different entities, between the men's side of the NCAA and the women's side. So kudos to the Oregon Ducks. Then we saw Baylor and Michigan play against each other. Now, see, this game was a close one. Baylor took on the Michigan Wolverines. Baylor was a 2 seed, Michigan being the number 6 seed, and that game went down to the wire. Baylor pulling off the win 78-75. They eked by. That was a really, really close game, and you got to give props to Baylor women's for pulling that one off. And then we go down and we see Indiana take on NC State. Now, this is one that kind of shocked a lot of folks because Indiana was a number 4 seed, NC State being a number 1 seed. And Indiana managed to pull off the upset. So the Hoosiers move on, and they win 73-70, knocking off the NC State women's team. And then on the other side, we got Georgia Tech and South Carolina, in which we saw South Carolina, another very, very strong number 1 overall seed, pretty handily hand. Georgia Tech lost 76-65. Georgia Tech, they held their own in that one, but in the end, South Carolina pulled it out. And then we saw Texas versus Maryland. Now, this one was a very tightly contested game, and I watched this game from start to finish. So, Maryland had the lead for a good portion of the game, but Texas just kept hanging around, and in the end, the women managed to pull off the upset. 6-seed Texas Longhorns beat the Maryland Terps 64-61, the 6 beating the 2 seed in that one. And then Arizona, we saw Arizona, the 3 seed, take on Texas A&M. Arizona, 3 seed, knocked out Texas A&M pretty handily, 74-59. And then Jordan Nixon's her Cinderella story run through the NCAA tournament thus far. She was a low-key favorite of mine. I was rooting for Texas A&M, but they managed to not be able to pull off that victory. And then the last matchup that I saved to discuss, because it was a very, very sought-after matchup that was talked about before the game was even started. We saw the UConn Huskies, my low-key favorite. I had them picked to win it all. And Iowa Hawkeyes, the number 1 versus number 5 seed, the UConn Huskies. We got Paige Beckers versus Caitlin Clark. Paige Beckers versus Caitlin Clark. So if you've been living under a rock lately and you don't know who either of these names are, I don't know what to tell you, but Paige Beckers is a freshman phenom and has been getting a lot of love from the nation as a whole. Both men and women alike have been watching the UConn Huskies play, and they're always an appealing team to watch play. But Paige Beckers has been doing this as a freshman, and she's been killing the tournament. So everybody was talking about Paige, but Caitlin Clark for the Iowa Hawkeyes was not a name to sleep on either. She was a very impressive young lady for the Iowa Hawkeyes, but Iowa ended up running into UConn, and UConn was too strong of a team in the end, and Iowa ended up losing this one pretty handily, 92-72. So the UConn Huskies, the number 1 seed, ended up beating Iowa, and Caitlin Clark ended up losing the one-on-one battle versus Paige Beckers. But Paige Beckers, man, I wanted to talk about her a little bit more. She's getting love from Breanna Stewart, a former UConn Husky. She's getting love from NBA players, Damian Lillard, Draymond Green, Megan Rapinoe, the U.S. soccer star. Plenty of eyes are on the UConn Huskies, and Paige Beckers is a big reason why people are paying attention to the UConn Huskies. But the biggest compliment came from me this weekend from Diana Taurasi, the great UConn Husky WNBA player, overseas player, Hall of Famer, future Hall of Famer. Diana Taurasi said that Paige Beckers is the best player in all of women's basketball right now. As a freshman. If it was up to me, she would be in the league next year. This young lady needs to be in a WNBA next year. She has no reason to wait, apart from the rules being that she has to wait. But she is ready. She is league bound. League her now. Put her in the league. She's in a league of her own, so therefore she needs to be in the league, the WNBA, because she's impressive. Man, oh man, is she impressive. And to say that there's still more games to be played, so that means if you haven't had a chance to watch her, please make sure that you're watching her, because the next matchup that they face is the Baylor Bears. And if she's able to take on the Baylor Bears and play at the pace that she's been playing at, I don't see them losing at all. So as I hinted at before, let's go through a little bit of these next matchups. So we're going to see Stanford go against Louisville, the 1 versus the 2 seed. We got Connecticut going against Baylor, the 1 versus the 2 seed there. We got Indiana going against Arizona. And then we got South Carolina going against Texas. So out of those matchups, I don't see any major upsets apart from that 3 versus 4 with Indiana going against Arizona. That's not really an upset to me per se. But I don't see Arizona winning that one. I can see Indiana pulling out the victory in that one, especially after the way they look versus NC State. It's a little bit more impressive than Arizona did versus Texas A&M. I do believe NC State to be a little bit tougher of an opponent than Texas A&M was. So I can see Indiana pulling out that one. And we look at this South Carolina versus Texas. There's no way I'm going to go against South Carolina in that one. We got Stanford and Louisville. There's no way I believe Louisville is going to knock off Stanford, so I'm going to take the number one in that one. And then Connecticut versus Baylor. And I keep hinting at the fact of this every single time I mention their name. But the UConn Huskies, I don't see 2021 being a year they're walking out of Texas without being the national champions. I believe on April 4th, we're going to crown the UConn Huskies as the national champions in the NCAA women's bracket. And that's all going to be thanks to Paige Beckers. So you can book it now. I got the UConn Huskies knocking off everybody en route to the championship and settling the March Madness Mania for the women's side by being the eventual champions. But we still got games to be played, so that's just only my personal opinion. So we'll see what ends up happening. So what about you guys saying let's bounce to the men's side of the bracket and see what we got going on there. So we saw the UConn women's Huskies, in my personal opinion, going to take the win. But the men's played just as much basketball this past weekend too. And there were some very exciting matchups, some pretty late games. I think the latest game tipped off at 9:55. And yes, your boy did stay up to watch that. I paid for it the next day. But I had to see my March Madness basketball. I didn't get this opportunity last year to watch these games, so I can't let it be of waste this year. I'm taking naps in between these games just to catch the later games, you know. I am a little bit older now in life, so I can't stay up and marathon through the games like I used to be able to. So I got to pace myself. Thankfully, we're getting towards the end of the tournament, so it's not as many games I'm watching as once. But it's still some pretty late games, you know. So the games tipped off. We had Gonzaga, the 1 seed, go against Creighton. We also had USC go against Oregon. Then we saw Michigan go against Florida State, UCLA and Alabama, Houston and Syracuse, Oregon State and Loyola Chicago. Shout out to Sister Jean. Oral Roberts in Arkansas, and then Baylor and Villanova. Now, starting with Gonzaga and Creighton, the 1 versus the 5, Gonzaga ran through Creighton, and as much as it pains me to say, Gonzaga looks really, really strong. And I know I've been not in a minority with this opinion, but I'm not sold on Gonzaga. But I keep looking foolish by saying that because, 1, they haven't lost a game all year, and 2, since I believe their third game of the season, they haven't won a game within single digits. They've had double-digit victories the rest of the year. So for me to constantly be saying, I'm not sold on Gonzaga, they're making me look foolish. Outright foolish. But I'm still not sold on Gonzaga. I'm sorry. But Gonzaga ended up pulling off the victory over the number 5 seeded Creighton. And then we went down and we saw USC versus Oregon play. And USC in the 6 versus the 7 matchup. USC won that matchup 82-68. Michigan, Florida State, the 1 versus the 4 seed. Now, I thought this game was going to be a lot closer than it turned out to be. Michigan ended up beating Florida State 76-58. Leonard Hamilton and normally has the Florida State Seminoles always in the mix, but they can't ever seem to get all the way to the national championship. And this year, you know, they had a pretty tough draw by having to face a really good Michigan team. And I believe before the game, the line for that game was like 1.5. So it was projected to be a pretty close game according to Vegas. But it ended up being a blowout. 76-58. The Michigan Wolverines knocked off the Florida State Seminoles. And then we go down and we see UCLA and Alabama. Now this is our upset city upset alert. So ring the alarm, sound the bells, upset city upset alert. If you don't remember, UCLA Bruins, they were part of the first 4 teams in. So they technically played when the field was still with 68 teams before we got it down to the 64 eventually to go. UCLA took on Michigan State on March 18th, and they won that game barely. They only won 86-80. Now we fast forward all the way down to March 29th, and UCLA is knocking off the number 2 Alabama Crimson Tide. The 11th seed UCLA Bruins knocked off Alabama. And I watched this game from start to finish. And this is one of those games that got me, man. I was dozing off a little bit because this game managed to go to overtime. It was a close game, but Alabama could not finish the game all because of free throws. They could not hit free throws to save their life. They shot less than 50. They shot barely above 50% for the game from the free throw line. If they made 75% of their free throws, they would have won the game easily. Easily. But they could not knock down their free throws. And because of that, they paid the price, and the UCLA Bruins are marching on. So shout out to UCLA Bruins for marching on. On the other side, we go and we look at Houston versus Syracuse, the 2 versus the 11 seed. I watched a lot of Houston basketball this season. I like watching the UCF Knights play. And so I had a chance to watch Houston play this year, and they look pretty impressive. And they've been pretty impressive in the tournament thus far, knocking off Buddy Boeheim and Syracuse 62-46. That one wasn't close as the score entailed. That was pretty handily controlled by Houston. And then we saw Sister Jean in Oregon State. Loyola Chicago, Sister Jeans versus Oregon State. And Oregon State managed to take that one 65-58. Broke a lot of hearts out there in America. We all love watching Sister Jean. We cannot get enough of Sister Jean. Sister Jean, Sister Jean. I love saying that name. But I'm not going to be saying it anymore because Loyola Chicago was knocked off by Oregon State 65-58. Shout out to Loyola Chicago, though, this year for having another great run in the NCAA tournament. And then we went and we saw Arkansas take on Oral Roberts. So Oral Roberts was trying to be the first team since the first 15 seed in a while to make it to the Elite Eight. However, that wasn't the case. They were knocked off. They lost to the Arkansas Razorbacks 72-70. That was a very close game, a heartbreaker for Oral Roberts. Oral Roberts had a chance at the end. The game-winning three-pointer, it was missed. It looked good to go, honestly, when it was let from the player's hands, but it went off. Their dancing days are done for the year. Oral Roberts gets knocked off by Arkansas, but what a great run through the tournament thus far. And then we turn our attention to the Baylor-Villanova matchup, the 1 versus the 5, and Villanova's knocked off by Baylor 62-51. So you may be saying, Baylor, that sounds familiar. Yes, the Baylor men and women's are both in the tournament and making a lot of noise in the tournament. So shout out to the Baylor Bears men and women's teams. So now, as we have our matchup set going forward, we got Gonzaga versus USC. We have Baylor versus Arkansas. We got Michigan versus UCLA. And now we got Oregon State versus Houston for our Elite Eight. The winner of these matchups going to the Final Four. Looking at these matchups, Gonzaga versus USC, as much as I am a little bit hesitant here to pick Gonzaga, I will have to say here that I'm going to have to go with Gonzaga in this matchup because I don't see the USC Trojans knocking off Gonzaga. So Gonzaga's going to stay undefeated again, and I believe they're going to knock off the Trojans here. And I'm going to say at least by 8 points. And then we go down and we look at Michigan versus UCLA in this Elite 8 matchup, the 1 versus the 11. As much as I want to root for this underdog story, I don't believe Michigan will be losing. I have Michigan beating UCLA Bruins, but I don't think this one's going to be a blowout. I do think Michigan's going to get all they can handle. It's a late start, the 9:57 game. And UCLA is going to give them all they can handle. They got nothing to lose. They're the underdogs fighting for their lives, just like every other team here. And they're going to give them some problems. So I got the Michigan Wolverines winning a close one versus the UCLA Bruins. And then as we go over onto the other side of the bracket, we look at Houston versus Oregon State. Oregon State versus Houston, 12 versus 2. 12 versus 2. Let me see, do a quick gut check. And what is my gut telling me right now? Gut check. I'm going to do it, folks. My gut's telling me Oregon State is going to pull off the upset here versus Houston. Oregon State is going to beat Houston, the 12 over the 2. We're going to go with Oregon State over Houston. Mark my words on that one, Oregon State over Houston. And then as we go up and we look at Baylor versus Arkansas, the 1 versus the 3. Arkansas has been playing really good this year, but I think that stops here. I think Baylor wins in a blowout on that one. And we move on to the Final Four. So, before our next podcast and the next time you hear my voice, I'm going to give you some predictions as to who I think is going to win it all. And I'm still going with the Michigan Wolverines. I am sold. Last time you heard my voice, I told you how much I love the way Juwan Howard has the Michigan Wolverines playing, and I stand by that. Michigan Wolverines are going to win it all. They're without their best player. I get that, but I do not see Gonzaga being able to outwit Mark Few, the head coach, outwitting Juwan Howard. The second you let Juwan Howard sniff that NCAA championship again, he's taking it all. He took it all. I mean, he was in the Fab Five, and, he's familiar with this territory, and now he is a coach, and he's back in this situation, and I think they're going to take advantage of it, and the Michigan Wolverines are going to win it all. So, my last question before we wrap up this first topic, speaking of winning it all, regardless of who the champion were to be this year, if a team like Gonzaga or a team like Michigan or let's say or Arkansas or Oregon State were to win the NCAA championship this year, win it all. They got the March Madness Mania championship. They're cutting down the nets. They're listening to the one shining moment. We're happy. Will there be an asterisk next to their name? And you may say, what are you talking about? Why would there be an asterisk next to their name? This as normal as it feels on the outside of us viewing this game, it's not a normal circumstance. These teams are in we'll say with a asterisk or quotation marks post-pandemic NCAA March Madness tournament. So we don't have the usual where they're traveling back and forth to these different arenas. All this took place in Indianapolis, Indiana. We don't have the huge crowds of some places could hold 50,000 people, field houses packed out with people. We don't have that this year. We got pretty small crowds, and that's allowing for a lot less pressure, in my opinion, on some of these players to perform. So you can kind of breathe a little bit, and you can see the underdogs kind of squeak through. You can see Oral Roberts make as big as a run as they made to the road to the Final Four this year. But does that mean that necessarily whoever is going to be the eventual champion will have an asterisk next to their name? I know that's a question I just popped into my mind. If Oregon State does win this year, do we look at this championship different than we would in years prior? If a Gonzaga were to prove to be very impressive and run the table and win it all and go undefeated, will we say, yeah, you were undefeated, but you did miss about 4 games in the regular season due to health and safety protocols in relation to COVID-19. You had a unorthodox year in which you won. It wasn't under normal circumstances. You weren't facing the huge crowd that you may have normally faced. So are we going to give you all the credit? I say yes, man. Yes, give them all the credit. No asterisk next to whoever is to be the eventual champion. I'm just happy to have the NCAA tournament back. And we look at the NBA tournament, the NBA bubble situation this past year, and the Los Angeles Lakers won the NBA championship. And a lot of people in the moment were saying, well, when we look back on this from years to come, are we going to say, oh, they won the bubble championship? And no, we're not. A champion is a champion. You got to work just as hard to win regardless of the circumstances. And if anything, whoever were to be the NCAA tournament champion this year should get more credit because of the circumstances. So no asterisk next to the name. Congratulations and kudos to whoever the eventual champion is going to be. And I say we just leave it at that. Like, stop with the shade and the ridicule and the questioning of how we're going to look at this. And let's just enjoy the moment because it's a great, great time to be in. All right, folks, we're going to wrap up this first segment of the podcast. We're going to get into a quick commercial break. But after the commercial break, we're going to hop into the NBA trade deadline. We're going to eventually later on in the show talk about the NFL and some of the big trade news that happened there. And then to wrap up our show today, we're going to talk about the best NBA trade deadline deals in history. But none of that's happening until after this commercial break.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines. They got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back, folks. Welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast, hosted by your boy Shaq Scott. So far today, we've talked about the men and women's NCAA March Madness tournament. We talked about the results, the upsets, the stars of the tournament thus far, both for the women's and the men's side. And now we're going to jump into the NBA. So keeping on that trend of the basketball this past weekend, we jump into the NBA. And why the NBA, you say? Why? Why are we talking about the NBA? We got all this great college basketball. The NBA is in the regular season. Why are they in the headlines? Well, the NBA trade deadline passed this past week. And normally, I'm one of those that get really, really hyped when it comes to the trade deadline. And I'm hyping myself up for my own personal biases, for my teams that I root for. And just for the parody of it all. Like, I want to see big names and big deals get done. But I hype myself up, and then I get let down because we see a bunch of role players get traded around or potential draft picks, and we don't really see a lot of shifting that we may think. But this year, boy, was I wrong. Wrong. We saw a bunch go down this year in regards to the NBA trade deadline, and we got you covered here on the GSMC Sports Podcast. We're going to go from the very start of the day to the end of the day. And a bunch of deals went on to start. And we'll go from the very, very beginning and go through. So it all started when I woke up that morning around 9 a.m. And what I normally do during trade deadline day is I turn on my notifications on all of my social medias, on all of my apps, my ESPN, my Bleacher Report. I'm checking Adrian Wojnarowski's Twitter, Sham's Twitter. I'm checking all my basketball insiders to see like who has the news. Turn notifications on to see what I'm going to hear. And like I said, a lot of times it's a bunch of no names. But this year that wasn't the case. I turned my phone on at 9 a.m. and by 1 o'clock that day, my battery was running low because it was a very busy day. So around 9 a.m., the Bucks and the Houston Rockets, officially made their deal official for PJ Tucker going from the Houston Rockets to the Milwaukee Bucks. And that deal was done on Friday, but by 9 a.m. Deadline day, it was official. So we started our day off reiterating the fact of okay, the Milwaukee Bucks just got themselves a little bit better by bringing along PJ Tucker. And I'm sure that makes Giannis a little bit happier because on defense, that'll be a lot less work that he'll have to do. And then we started hearing the rumblings around 10 o'clock. So the Magic were very active before the deadline. And in the headlines, they were floating their names out there of Oladipo and Aaron Gordon, and right before deadline day, they let it be known that they're going to shop Nikola Vucevic, their all-star, the two-time all-star, and that they're open to all deals, and basically saying that anybody who's not a young star that they got, the Mo Bambas, the Markelle Fultz, the Cole Anthonys, they're up for grabs, basically. They're all up for grabs. So we knew the Magic were going to be active. Just how active was what remained to be seen. And so around 10 o'clock that morning, Aaron Gordon's name kept floating out there along with Evan Fournier. And we're reading the headlines and it's saying Aaron Gordon may be on the move to Boston. And Evan Fournier may be on the move to Boston. There may be a package that involves three teams between the Orlando Magic, the Boston Celtics, and maybe a potential third team that saw Marcus Smart going on the deal from Boston to Orlando and Aaron Gordon going with Evan Fournier to Boston, making them a little bit more stout as a team. But it was all rumors at that point. So the first deal that actually go through was between the Chicago Bulls. So Lauri Markkanen of the Chicago Bulls was the first pinball to drop or the first name that we all noticed and we're like, oh, okay, we got some traction going on here. What's going on? Some people are actually making some trades here. Should this be something I'm paying attention to? So we see that Lauri Markkanen gets traded from the Chicago Bulls. And you may say, man, that's not that big of a deal. Why should I care about that? You should care about that because it's our first big deal of the day. And it means that teams are actually going to be active. And then, to me, that symbolizes, okay, you can pay attention to this NBA trade deadline this year because this is not going to be one in which teams are just sitting back and letting their potential idea of trades happening but not actually going through. But what ended up happening to symbolize the start of the trade deadline was a kind of name in theory, but a player who's been around the league for a while, but is a two-time NBA champion. JaVale McGee got traded from the Cleveland Cavaliers to the Denver Nuggets. And so you may be saying, like, why is that such a big deal? The Cavaliers are not that impressive, but that makes the Denver Nuggets a more impressive team. And you may have forgotten, but JaVale McGee used to be a Denver Nugget at a different stage in his career. Some may argue that this was a less mature JaVale McGee, but he was a Denver Nugget. So him returning to the Denver Nuggets, now a two-time champion and a more focused NBA player on his role, I believe made a big impact and played a good part in why Denver was very active in the idea of pursuing JaVale McGee. So JaVale McGee ends up going to the Denver Nuggets, and that kind of like opens up everybody's eyes and is like, okay, we got some traction going on here. And as we continue through the day, so at this point it's not even 11 o'clock yet, and the Magic are still entertaining the idea of trading Vucevic. So they're only all-star on the team, and one of their first all-stars since the Dwight Howard era, averaging about 25 points this year and 12 rebounds, is being talked about in deals. So people are thinking, like, are you sure? Like, the Magic are going to trade Vucevic? And before we could all question it, boom, Woj drops a Woj bomb, and the Chicago Bulls and the Orlando Magic have agreed to, in terms and principle, the deal was agreed upon. Nikola Vucevic and Al-Farouq Aminu, and the Magic in return got Otto Porter, Wendell Carter Jr., and 2 future first-round picks, and everybody immediately lost their freaking minds. They lost their minds. How could the Magic trade Vucevic for Otto Porter and Wendell Carter Jr. and 2 future first-round picks? Why would they do such a thing? They just immediately got worse. And I challenge all of you and say, did they? Have you been watching Magic basketball this year? Because I have. And the ceiling wasn't that high for them. So I think they kind of knew they capped out where they were with Vucevic. And Vucevic has just turned 30 this year. And were the Magic willing to sit around and waste more of his prime to only sniff the first round of the playoffs and keep getting eliminated? No, they said they wanted to take a shot at the future, and they got a strong young core as they're banged up this year, so they got a future to look forward to. So they were willing to pull the trigger on that deal, and Vucevic was the first domino to fall from the Orlando Magic. And Al-Farouq Aminu also was collateral damage. Unfortunately, he did have to leave the Orlando Magic as well. But that got the Chicago Bulls a lot better. So Zach LaVine gets a lot of help over there in Chicago now with Al-Farouq Aminu and Nikola Vucevic going over. So then, now, Vucevic is off the table for the Magic, and people are saying, all right, if the Magic are willing to trade Nikola Vucevic, it's about to get real in the field. That must mean they're about to overhaul. And yes, they definitely were ready to overhaul, as their next deal that happened around 11:30 was Orlando sending Evan Fournier to Boston. So I mentioned earlier how they were flirting with the idea of maybe a 3-team trade or an expanded trade that brought Marcus Smart. But this one was kind of perplexing because the Magic did trade Evan Fournier, which was expected, to the Boston Celtics, but all they got back was 2 second-round picks. Now, to me, I felt like they could have got a little bit more out of that. But who am I to judge? The Magic got rid of Evan Fournier. They got rid of his contract. He's an unrestricted free agent after this year. He's been hinting at the fact that he's not going to re-sign with them. So they don't get anything. They don't walk away empty-handed. They just say, you know what? Let's pull the trigger. Let's let Evan Fournier go. We'll deal with it on the back end. So now the Magic are without Nikola Vucevic and Evan Fournier. So all of our eyes as NBA fans, NBA analysts, me as a podcast host, we're looking and saying, the Magic are clearly the most active in NBA free agency this year. In NBA trade deadline this year. What's the next domino to fall? All that's left is Aaron Gordon. And now I'm thinking, well, if Aaron Gordon wasn't a part of that Evan Fournier deal, then where is he going? And there still were talks at this time because during the trade deadline, all of these trades are agreed to on principle. They're not official until the next day. So a lot of times you'll see deals that will include names, but then when they go official, you'll see 3 or 4 names added or removed and compensatory picks or cash being thrown in there. But so at this point, I'm like, okay, the Magic are possibly going to try to throw Aaron Gordon in on this deal, but then it goes silent because there's still talks of who's going to be pursuing Aaron Gordon at this time, and they're talking about the Minnesotas, the Houstons, and the Boston Celtics, but a team that some of us were talking about but weren't really like serious on the idea of doing it was the Denver Nuggets because they just got JaVale McGee. But I think that was just a way of them warming themselves up. Okay, we're going for it all. We saw the Denver Nuggets have a strong NBA bubble this past year. They played really well, and all they looked was a couple pieces too short. They got a surefire star in Nikola Jokic, and they got a budding star in Jamal Murray, and they just need some help. So what do? They trade with the Orlando Magic. You guessed it. They traded Aaron Gordon. The Orlando Magic traded Aaron Gordon to the Denver Nuggets. And this trade, I'm not as critical of as opposed to the Nikola Vucevic trade the Magic made, because in return, the Magic got Gary Harris, who in my personal opinion is a very impressive player. He just has been a little bit injury prone, but if he can manage to stay healthy, he'll be a huge piece for them, a huge wing for that team and for the future, which is most important for the Magic right now. The Nuggets are in the now, the Magic are in the future. So you got to keep that in mind when you're analyzing these trades. So the Magic get Gary Harris, RJ Hampton, a first-round pick, all for Aaron Gordon. So the Magic are racking up these picks. Now, all these picks aren't for this year, some of them for future years, but nonetheless, they are getting picks. And for those of you that are saying, well, what about the now? The Magic aren't in the now. I keep reminding you, the Magic are not in the now. The Nuggets are in the now. The Magic kind of hit their ceiling already. They've gone to the playoffs the past 2 years and had first-round exits. So it's pointless for them to keep playing this same game. What's the definition of insanity? Doing the same thing over and over and over again, but expecting different results. That's what happened with the Magic these past 2 years. So they're saying, okay, let's pull the trigger, make some changes, and see what we can get on the back end for this. So the Magic get rid of their 3 core players. We got Aaron Gordon out the window. We got Nikola Vucevic and Evan Fournier, the 3 big pieces that the Orlando Magic were trying to move. They did, and it was over. So there were some more trades to go down. We had Troy Brown and Mo Wagner from Washington being traded to Chicago for Daniel Gafford and Chandler Hutchison. And you see how I mentioned before about sometimes names that may not be as popular are thrown in there. We did see George Hill get traded to the Philadelphia 76ers. Now, this trade was interesting because Kyle Lowry was another huge name that was on the market for the trade deadline. So we had Aaron Gordon, Nikola Vucevic were big names, Evan Fournier, Kyle Lowry, Lonzo Ball. These were big names that were all talked about for the trade deadline. There was also talks of Kelly Oubre and the Andre Drummonds and what these teams would do with these players that are kind of on the fence. They're productive for their teams, but they're also assets. And so the 76ers were in talks with the Raptors leading up to the trade deadline, talking about the idea of having a homecoming for Kyle Lowry, who's from Philadelphia, to come play for the Sixers. And that would have been great for the Sixers because that would have taken a lot of the point guard pressure off of Ben Simmons. He can still create and be that playmaker, but now you got a shooter in Kyle Lowry, and an experienced NBA champion who knows how to win and can do it all for your team. Now, Kyle Lowry is a little bit older, but I think that would have fit with the 76ers because they already got some very established pieces there. But in the end, that trade ended up not happening because the Sixers decided to pursue George Hill in replacement for Kyle Lowry. So Kyle Lowry's name was floated around. He ended up staying in Toronto. Another name that was floating around out there was Lonzo Ball with the New Orleans Pelicans. Stan Van Gundy was in talks and entertaining ideas of maybe pursuing a potential trade and realizing the value of Lonzo Ball. But in the end, Lonzo Ball ended up staying put. The next big name to go for the trade deadline was Rajon Rondo and Lou Williams. And Rajon Rondo, for those of you who are thinking, like, where the heck has Rajon Rondo been this year? Rajon Rondo was a part of the Atlanta Hawks this year. He's that leadership that they needed, that winning mentality, and he's been instilling it into the culture of the Atlanta Hawks. And it's not all about the minutes for a player of Rajon Rondo's caliber. You're looking for Rajon Rondo to have impacts on your team. So that's part of the reason why he was enticed and the Hawks were willing to pay him a little bit more to come in, to give that guidance to the Trae Youngs and the other point guards that are part of that organization. But the Clippers realized that we need that veteran leadership. They watched him in the bubble last year. They watched playoff Rondo, as we all call him. And they say, we got Lou Will here, Lemon Pepper Lou, as some call him, as he had his infamous incident last year in the bubble in which he left for the strip club and had some lemon pepper wings in the defense that he presented to the NBA, but was still suspended. But the Los Angeles Clippers know what they got in Lou Will and know what they want in Rajon Rondo, and they want a leader and a defender. And they don't have as much defense as they used to, because keep in mind, they lost Montrezl Harrell this past year, and Patrick Beverley has been banged up. So when they had the chance to jump at a proven defender and a leader, they chose to do that, and they traded Lou Williams to the Atlanta Hawks for Rajon Rondo. And the rest of the trade deadline was pretty quiet when it came to names. There were some pieces that were traded to Pelicans. They ended up trading J.J. Redick to the Mavericks for Nicolo Melli. And the Celtics traded Daniel Tice to the Bulls for Mo Wagner. And the Warriors traded with the Spurs, Marquise Chris. And Brad Wanamaker was traded from the Warriors to the Hornets. And literally the last minute of the trade deadline, there was a big name that I don't think enough of us are talking about. And that name came with Victor Oladipo. At the very last 10 minutes of the trade deadline, which is arguably the most interesting part because teams get desperate. And a lot of teams that were asking for a lot at this point of the trade deadline, they kind of give in because they don't want to just fall back on keeping an unhappy player. And the Houston Rockets had a quote-unquote unhappy player who's been playing his butt off for them, but it's just not working out for them. Houston Rockets were on a 20-game losing streak quite recently. And they decided to part ways with Victor Oladipo. Victor Oladipo was traded from the Houston Rockets in the witching hour of the NBA trade deadline to the Miami Heat. The Miami Heat got Victor Oladipo. And you may be saying, whoa, they must have given up Tyler Hero. They had to give up some big names and some draft picks. No, folks. All they had to give up was Kelly Olynyk. Kelly Olynyk for Victor Oladipo. The Rockets agreed to this trade. Kelly Olynyk for Victor Oladipo. Now, don't get me wrong. Kelly Olynyk has been solid for the Miami Heat in the 4 years that he's been there. A reliable shooter for them. Somebody who's been able to stretch the floor for them. But a defensive liability he is. And they traded him for Victor Oladipo. I feel like I'm in the minority here by saying Victor Oladipo is not washed. People are treating him as if his career is over. Yes, he had the ruptured quad injury that was pretty bad in Indiana, but that's an injury that takes years to recover from. I believe if not this year, next year, we're going to see an established Victor Oladipo, but how can a player establish himself if he can't get comfortable in the organization? He went from Indiana to Houston. Houston is a dumpster fire right now. But he's still managing to put up 14 to 17 points a game. That's not that bad. Victor Oladipo may not be as athletic before the injury, but he's still a bucket. A walking bucket. And to let the Miami Heat get a walking bucket for Kelly Olynyk? That's not fair, man. It's just not fair. But shout out to Pat Riley. They call him Mafia Pat. Pat Riley over there managed to finesse the Houston Rockets into taking Kelly Olynyk. That's their problem now, Poor Steven Silas, brand new head coach, just traded away one of his more reliable scorers, all for Kelly Olynyk. Hopefully Kelly Olynyk can stretch the floor there for Houston Rockets. But Miami Heat won that trade, in my opinion, like going away. So that's how we ended the trade deadline. As you can see, as we ran through those trades, a very, very eventful trade deadline. And I just have a couple of questions on the back end now that we've gone through the trade deadline. So what if you're one of these teams that has a player that was supposed to be traded? We're talking about the Kyle Lowrys and the Kelly Oubres and Alonzo Balls. Now they got to play the rest of the season. On the team that tried to trade them away, actively was engaged in trade talks. And then how do you think these players are going to react? Especially if the teams are losing like the Toronto Raptors and are having a tough time like the New Orleans Pelicans. Well, how do you expect these players to react? Kelly Oubre has not looked comfortable in Golden State since he's got there. And to have his name in trade talks and then now to turn around and expect him to come out and be a starter and play starter solid minutes, I don't see that happening. So I see another up and down year for Kelly Oubre in Golden State, especially coming off of the heels of him almost being traded. Kyle Lowry, on the other hand, is a professional, and I believe that this is going to be a tough year overall. The Raptors are proving that they're having a very hard time without Kawhi Leonard. So I think this is just going to be a year in which Kyle Lowry has the perspective to say, this is going to be a rough year for us here in Tampa. We're not in Toronto. We're down here in Tampa playing basketball, our home games here. It's going to be a rough year. Have the right perspective. I am a free agent this year, and we'll see what the future holds for me here. And then Lonzo Ball has always had his name in trade talk. So I think at this point he's just used to it, There always are conversations about Lonzo Ball and trade discussions for him. So for Lonzo, this is the norm, and he goes and he balls out. All pun intended. All right, as we go on and take a bigger look at the winners and the losers of these trade deadlines, to wrap up this segment, I just want to highlight a couple of teams here that I do believe came out big winners in this historic NBA trade deadline. My biggest winner from this trade deadline has got to be the Denver Nuggets. The Denver Nuggets, who I mentioned before, were a team last year that was very close to winning it all. They scared a bunch of teams last year. Look, do you remember how they made the Los Angeles Clippers look? Kawhi Leonard, Paul George, and Pat Beverly were frustrated by Jamal Murray and Nikola Jokic last year. They stole the show for the bubble. Absolutely stole the show. The Denver Nuggets were literally, it looked like last year, maybe 1 or 2 pieces away. And they didn't have to give up anything in reality to get Aaron Gordon. Yes, they gave up a Gary Harris who's been hurt for them, or RJ Hampton who's been sitting on the bench for them. But they got Aaron Gordon, an athletic wing player who gets to play with a team that's solid already, so his role is not going to be super demanding of him, so he can take the time to get comfortable. And if this first year is like a 10 to 15 points a game for them, that may be all they needed to put them over the top. But it's a solid trade for them and a huge win. It takes a lot of pressure off of Nikola Jokic. And don't forget, they also traded for JaVale McGee. So they got a solid basket protector there. So that's less pressure on Nikola Jokic. The Denver Nuggets are a very impressive team and a scary team to look out for. So shout out to the Denver Nuggets, and they're huge winners from this NBA trade deadline. Now, one of the losers in this situation to me has got to be the Boston Celtics. They have been one of the most perplexing teams this year. And to go into this trade deadline with the idea of you being in the Aaron Gordon sweepstakes and to end up striking out and only ended up with Evan Fournier, I don't think that's going to put them anywhere near over the top. In the Eastern Conference that has the Brooklyn Nets in it, and all you get is Evan Fournier, a wing shooter, a struggling defender, it's disappointing. Disappointing to say the least. And then to end off the trade deadline, I didn't even mention this fact, buyout season is upon us. So the Nets, after the trade deadline, signed LaMarcus Aldridge, who agreed to a buyout from the San Antonio Spurs. And as of today, Andre Drummond signed with the Los Angeles Lakers. So the rich are getting richer here. The Nets added LaMarcus Aldridge and Andre Drummond. So the Nets recently added Blake Griffin and LaMarcus Aldridge all within the past week and a half. Now, in my own personal opinion, I don't believe LaMarcus Aldridge to have that much left in his career. But come playoff time, when you need a bucket, you can never have too many buckets, you know. And this is a year in which we're seeing a lot of injuries. So it's always smart to load up when you can get somebody at a veteran's minimum. And they did that with LaMarcus Aldridge. Now, the bigger pickup out of the two between the Nets and the Lakers, I do believe to be Andre Drummond, who's been pretty consistent this year. He's been about 17 points per game and about 15 rebounds per game this year. And he's going to help out the Los Angeles Lakers, who are going to try to ease back Anthony Davis and ease back LeBron James. So he'll help them when come playoff time, especially if they end up facing the Nets. So what say you, folks? What say you? What did you think about this trade deadline? Did you think it was as in exciting as I believed it to be, or did you just think it was like a bunch of names and not much real talent going around? Let us know. We welcome your opinion. Make sure you engage with us on Twitter. Engage in the comments as you're rating and subscribing. Let me know what you think. But speaking of what I think it's time that we take another break. And on the other half of this break, we're going to get into why the NFL was in the headlines this past weekend and what the 49ers and the Miami Dolphins and Patriots may have in common. And then we're going to end our show referencing and talking about some of the best NBA deadline deals in history. But all that's going to be done on the other side of this break.
Check out the show that's built on the MMA, from the UFC to extreme cage fighting. They got the fights covered. Check out the GSMC MMA podcast. Get the latest news on past or upcoming fights. Join us as we talk to and about some of the biggest names in the MMA, past, present, and future. When it's the fight game, there's just one show to check out. GSMCpodcast.com/MMA-podcast. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Oh, yeah, if you hear that music, folks, that means we are back. We are back. Welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast. I'm your host, Shaq Scott, and man, has it been such a great show for us thus far. We talked about the NCAA March Madness tournament for the men and women's. We then talked about the NBA trade deadline and some of the buyouts that went down and the insanity of the trade deadline, the winners and the losers of the deadline. And now we're going to take it off the court onto the field, and we're going to discuss the NFL. And don't forget, later, we're going to talk about the all-time best NBA trade deadline deals in history. But first, the NFL. All right, this past weekend was a great weekend for sports altogether, but it was very, very heavily basketball dominated. That doesn't mean that we didn't have anything going on in the world of the NFL. In particular, we had a pretty big trade go down. So for those of you that were living under a rock, sleeping through it, still struggling from this time change, whatever your excuse may be, I got you covered here, and I'm going to let you know what you missed. The NFL draft is coming up in April. And if you don't recall, there are some pretty big names this year who have some pretty high draft picks. So we're going to just go over the draft order real quick. We got the Jacksonville Jaguars with the number 1 overall pick, the New York Jets. And I'm going to stop there because before this weekend, the number 3 pick was the Miami Dolphins. And it was going to be an interesting draft because the Miami Dolphins have Tua Tagovailoa, but they had the decision to make. Do we stick with Tua or do we go after with our number 3 pick, another quarterback? And they kind of answered those questions with this most recent development because according to Adam Schefter, on March 26th, as of 1:04 p.m., filed to ESPN, the Miami Dolphins traded the number 3 overall pick to the San Francisco 49ers for the number 12 pick, a 2021 third-round pick, San Francisco's compensatory pick for them hiring Robert Saleh, and first-round picks in 2022 and 2023 per sources. A blockbuster deal with massive ramifications for years to come. This is all according to ESPN's Adam Schefter. Now, what does that mean? What does that mean? That means that the Dolphins are pretty much saying, we're going to ride this Tua train out. We're pretty sold on Tua. And just as we thought that they were done there, the Dolphins then traded their number 12 overall pick to the Philadelphia Eagles, along with the 2022 first-round pick and the number 123 overall pick this year for the Eagles' number 6 pick and the number 156 pick. So, what ended up happening? The Miami Dolphins traded down from the number 3 pick essentially to the number 6 pick and got another additional 2021 draft pick from the San Francisco 49ers. So the Miami Dolphins have had the number 3 pick and don't have it anymore. That belongs to the San Francisco 49ers. Now, that may be something that you're like, why is that such a big deal? The San Francisco 49ers have franchise quarterback, don't they? They brought in Jimmy G. They got Kyle Shanahan, a coach that they were pretty high on. But don't forget, they don't have Kyle Shanahan anymore. They got Kyle Shanahan. They're pretty high on the idea of having Jimmy Garoppolo, but that wasn't the case this past year. The San Francisco 49ers are in the quarterback market. Now, as shocking as that may be to you, if you're a 49ers fan, I'm going to apologize now. Pull over your car. However, wherever you are listening, if you need to sit down, just hear me out for the next couple of minutes here. The San Francisco 49ers are in the space for a quarterback. They're on the search. Jimmy G is not the quarterback for the future for them. He's been injury prone, and when he has been on the field, it hasn't been productive. And I think the San Francisco 49ers are going to move on from Jimmy Garoppolo. Now, the San Francisco 49ers moving on for Jimmy Garoppolo couldn't have come at a better time because this year, there's some pretty big names going into this NFL draft. If you may recall, Trevor Lawrence is the number 1 overall pick, highly projected. And I would be completely and utterly shocked that Jacksonville Jaguars didn't select Trevor Lawrence from the Clemson Tigers. But then you got BYU's Zach Wilson. You got Justin Fields. And you got this kid out of North Dakota State, Trey Lance. And you got Mac Jones, who's moving up a lot of draft boards because of his most recent Alabama Pro Day. So that makes things a lot more interesting for the San Francisco 49ers. And so we have the Dolphins who had this number 3 overall pick, shocking us all by saying, we're going to stick with who we got. We like our guy in Tua, and we're going to ride this out. And you know what, San Francisco, you can have this. We'll take the number 6 overall pick from the Philadelphia Eagles. And if a quarterback just so happens to slide there, maybe we take him. But maybe we just stout up our offensive line a little bit more. Maybe we go after a defensive juggernaut. Who knows what they're going to do with the number 6 overall pick. It's going to be pretty interesting to see. But there are so many layers to why this deal is, quote-unquote, having ramifications for years to come. And it's not just for the Dolphins and the 49ers, because if the 49ers are saying to themselves, okay, we got the number 3 overall pick, they're telling the general public, Kyle Shanahan said, Jimmy Garoppolo is our quarterback for this year. And that man could have not had sounded more not convincing to anybody, especially to me. I looked at that press conference and I was like, this guy's not believable. There's no way. How can you say that with a straight face and have the number 3 overall pick? Yes, in theory, you may say, he's our quarterback for this year. I'm going to draft a quarterback, but Jimmy Garoppolo is going to play this year and we're going to ease his quarterback in. You may have those intentions, but I'm telling you right now, buddy, that's not happening. If you draft one of these guys, we're not going to say Trevor Lawrence because there's no way he's not going to go to the Jaguars. But if you draft a Justin Wilson, a Justin Fields, a Zach Wilson, a Trey Lance, a Mac Jones, there's no way they're not seeing the field this year. No way. No way, especially when we know what we got with Jimmy Garoppolo. And so what I think is going to end up happening is the San Francisco's 49ers got this number 3 overall pick, right? So follow me here, 49er fans. You got your number 3 overall pick. You're going to get happy because you're going to draft a nice young prospect that you can call your own and build from the ground up. He can build from this organization from the ground up, right? You got him. So what do you do with Jimmy Garoppolo? He's still an asset. And there's still teams out there who need a quarterback. And one of those teams had this quarterback. But they had to let him go because they bet on their other quarterback who is now a Tampa Bay Buccaneer. Yes, of course, I'm talking about the New England Patriots. The New England Patriots, I do believe, are going to be the front runners to get Jimmy Garoppolo. So this past offseason, Cam Newton returned to New England on a 1-year deal. Kind of another prove-it deal, but the Patriots' hands were kind of tied here. There weren't really much options out there. But what that did allow them to do is still to keep the cap space and spend a bunch of money on their defense. And the Patriots unloaded on their defense this past year. They're probably going to have one of the better defenses next year. And that's Bill Belichick's calling card already. He tends to make good with what he has from the beginning. So to then add great free agents is a great prospective future for the New England Patriots. But they still got Cam Newton at quarterback. And he was not impressive at all last year. So you ask yourself, okay, we got Cam Newton last year, but we have the opportunity to get Jimmy G. Do we take that? And the answer is heck yes. Heck yes, you take that opportunity. You go after Jimmy Garoppolo. Absolutely. You go after Jimmy Garoppolo, and you take him, and you trade for him. And you got assets, and you got potential draft picks that you may need to give up. But the 49ers are going to be more likely to give him up because they're going to have a future that they're going to draft in the Zach Wilson or in the Justin Fields or in the Mac Jones or in a Trey Lance, whoever it may be. They got a future they're going to build around. So they may be more likely to let go of the Jimmy Garoppolo if it means that we're going to see a Justin Fields hit the field earlier. All pun intended. Or a Zach Wilson. And speaking of the Zach Wilson and the Justin Fields, a lot of these players are having their pro days recently. And I'm going to be honest with you. I'm going to be 100% transparent with you guys. I was not sold on Zach Wilson. I watched him play in college. I watched him play at BYU. And I thought he was impressive. But I thought that offense was very limiting. And his skills just didn't impress me. He's very athletic. But I just was like, this is not an NFL level talent. Like, this is not an NFL starting quarterback to me. This is a guy who I see potentially being a Taysom Hill potentially, and that may be disrespectful to Zach Wilson. But that's what I thought his ceiling was. But then this pro day happened. BYU's pro day happened, and some footage is leaking on Instagram and Twitter of Zach Wilson at pro day. And I got to admit, y'all, this man looks impressive. He looks impressive. He's throwing on the run, and there was a particular pass in question in which he was rolling out to his opposite hand and literally swiveled his hip with the flick of the wrist, about a 60-yard pass and hit a receiver right in stride. And I was like, whoa, this kid's impressive. He's pretty dang impressive. And as much as I wanted to hate and say, he's all right, he's not that good. Nah, he's good. He's good. And so I do see NFL talent on the back end of Zach Wilson. Now, I may not just jump out the window and say here and now that I do believe he's going to be better than Justin Fields or even a Trey Lance or a Mac Jones, but he is pretty impressive. And that's a testament to this NFL Pro Day that he had. But if it were me, looking at the speed in which Justin Fields has, and he ran an insane 40 time for his Ohio State Pro Day, I'm going to pick the safer bet to me. If Justin Fields is still there at the number 3 pick, I'll pick him. Or if Mac Jones is still there, I may pick him. But I could see the San Francisco 49ers either way going ahead and trading Jimmy Garoppolo and pursuing a Justin Fields or a Zach Wilson or even a Mac Jones. And a Mac Jones is another name that we saw this past year for Alabama. And a lot of times Alabama quarterbacks get a bad rap to me. You know, they play there and they are under the Saban umbrella and they got nothing but 5-star recruits around them. So a lot of times the quarterbacks get overshadowed because the expectations for them are national championship or bust already. And if you're not blowing every team out by 50, then you're looked at as just an average Alabama quarterback. You're looked at you're going to be the next Greg McElroy. You're looked at as if you're going to be the just average Alabama quarterback. But in recent history, they've had some pretty impressive quarterbacks. Jalen Hurts is going to have the keys to the Philadelphia Eagles next year. That was an Alabama quarterback before he went to Oklahoma. Tua was an Alabama quarterback before he got hurt. And he has the keys to a franchise. That's 2 former Crimson Tide quarterbacks with keys to prestigious franchises coming up. So that stigma of the Alabama quarterbacks should be out the window by now. We should all be saying, you know, maybe I should be looking at this Mac Jones. And looking at his pro day was pretty impressive. Now, he didn't have any throws in which I was like, man, this guy's athletic. Some Patrick Mahomes type on the run and swelling of the hips and a flick of the wrist. But he was accurate. The ball was coming out pretty good. Deep ball pass was great. Hitting receivers in stride. It looked really impressive. And if it was up to me, I would have a pretty hard time looking the other way when it came to Mac Jones if he were to be available for me at that number 3 overall pick if I was the San Francisco 49ers. But either way, it's a great situation for the 49ers to be in. You went from being out of the quarterback sweepstakes to now being out of the quarterback sweepstakes, potentially having to rely on a Jimmy Garoppolo for another year, not knowing what his ceiling was going to be, to having one of the every fan's great dream and quite honestly every GM's dream, the idea of drafting the potential next franchise-changing quarterback. You got Justin Fields, you're going to have Mac Jones, and you're possibly going to have Trey Lance or Zach Wilson sitting right there for you at the number 3 overall pick. We know the Jaguars are going with Trevor Lawrence, but you got the chance to get one of these guys and make a huge change for your franchise. You would be foolish to not take that opportunity. Absolutely foolish. There's no way they're going to let that go. No way. No way. Now, as I think about this says a lot for the 49ers, but it also said a lot for the Miami Dolphins. So I mentioned a little bit earlier how this basically says that the Dolphins were pretty sold on Tua. We're sold on Tua. You know, we saw last year Tua split some rep times with Ryan Fitzpatrick, and Brian Flores was allegedly trying to protect Tua and ease him into the NFL. And for me, from the outside perspective, not being able to see Tua every day in practice, that scared me. That scared me. If you weren't willing to put Tua over Ryan Fitzpatrick last year and ease him onto the field, and in big game situations, we saw Brian Flores pulling Tua out and putting Ryan Fitzpatrick in to finish out quarters and halves and games, and watching the team rally around him. How do you turn around and say the next year, okay, now I trust him to give the keys to my franchise? What changed? Has it been that long? Has he had that impressive of an offseason? Maybe it was health related. You know, Tua was coming off a pretty rough injury, and for a quarterback to come off of a hip injury and for it to be your rookie year, and he did have some situations in which he had issues with his thumb this year, and he did have some little nicks throughout the year. So we may not have seen 100% Tua this past year, but for the idea of a coach to say, you know, I pulled him out to save him. We know what we have in the future. I pulled him out to save him, and we kind of want to have the guys rally around somebody, and they rallied around Ryan Fitzpatrick. But that said a lot to me. That said you didn't trust him, and if you didn't trust him last year, you're going to trust him from this year, from week 1? I guess so. Here's to hoping Tua has a great year. You know, I hope the kid does well. I believe him to be a good quarterback. I don't believe him to be a franchise-changing quarterback, but I do believe him to be a good quarterback. You know, the Dolphins did make some moves, so they still have the number 6 pick coming up this year. And so that could be a skill player they go after. There could be an offensive lineman that they could go after. There could be a defensive player they go after. We don't know what they're going to do with that pick. But whatever they do with that pick, I do hope they decide to kind of beef up this team around Tua, because I would hate for the kid to finally get the keys to the franchise and then to fall flat. Does that mean a 7-9 year for Tua? Does that mean Dolphins missing the playoffs, or does that mean they make it to the playoffs this year? And as reported earlier this day of the recording of this podcast, the NFL owners are going to vote on this week whether or not we're going to have a 17-game NFL season this upcoming year. And a lot of NFL players aren't happy about that. But it's something that was discussed in the new collective bargaining agreement that was signed this past year. So we knew this day was coming. So we got a 17-game NFL season. And you may be saying, well, what does that have to do with Tua? Well, if Tua struggled through a 16-game NFL season between injuries and getting pulled for Ryan Fitzpatrick, you going to trust him for 17 games this year? 17 games? Brian Flores, you're giving Tua the keys to this franchise for 17 games? That's scary to me, man. I'm sorry. That is terrifying. I don't see that. And I'm sorry, Dolphins fans, don't get mad at me, but I don't see them making the playoffs this year. And I may be eating my words on this, you know. For the future, they may be a playoff team, but I don't see them this year being a playoff team. What I do see happening is the San Francisco 49ers drafting themselves a quarterback, trading Jimmy Garoppolo, the New England Patriots getting Jimmy Garoppolo, and then potentially the New England Patriots could still have the number 15 overall pick and draft somebody else if they wanted to kind of beef up that speed receiver that they may need in New England. They still don't have anybody over the top they can go after and go out there and get you a bunch of 60 to 70 yard gains, but they did sign 2 really good tight ends this offseason. So clearly Bill Belichick is saying, we are building for the future and the now here. I got Hunter Henry. I got some big name tight ends this year, and I'm going to build for the future, and I do believe that we're going to have a better offensive year this year. And does that include Jimmy Garoppolo? I truly believe so. I believe Bill Belichick is going to go out there and trade for Jimmy Garoppolo. And the 49ers are going to have a new quarterback, and they're going to be building for the future. And the Dolphins are going to be banking on Tua, and they're going to be building for the now? Or will it be for the future? Only the future will tell, and time will tell what will happen. But I don't believe that the Miami Dolphins made the best decision by trading that number 3 overall pick. If it had been me, I may have taken a flyer on Justin Fields. You know, if you already were comfortable enough as a head coach last year with Brian Flores in splitting reps between Ryan Fitzpatrick and Tua, why not split the reps between Justin Fields and Tua? I'm sold. Sign me up right now. Split the rest between a Zach Wilson and Tua. I'm sold. You weren't sold on them. I'm sold right now. But we'll see. Who knows what they decide to do? I'm excited either way. NFL draft is right around the corner. It's been announced that it's going to be in Cleveland this year, and players are going to be allowed to attend. So we're getting back to our quote-unquote normal. We're not going to be watching a virtual draft this year, although I'm sure some players may decide to stay home. But either way, the NFL draft will be right around the corner, and the San Francisco 49ers have the number 3 pick this year. And before we close out this segment, I'm just going to run through the top 15 picks just to kind of give you an idea of what we can expect as of today. So the Jacksonville Jaguars got the number 1 overall pick with Trevor Lawrence. Then they got the New York Jets. And then you got the San Francisco 49ers, Atlanta Falcons, who I didn't mention, but that's another team that could be in the running for a quarterback because Matt Ryan has had a pretty rough past 4 years. So the Atlanta Falcons, the Cincinnati Bengals, Miami Dolphins, Detroit Lions, Carolina Panthers, Denver Broncos, Dallas Cowboys, the Giants, Eagles, Chargers, Vikings, and the Patriots. That wrap out the top 15 for the NFL draft. But I'm just as excited. We shall see. Shout out to the 49ers fans. Shout out to the Dolphins. Shout out to everybody involved. Shout out to the NFL, man. We got the NFL draft right around the corner, and we still are talking NFL news, and we're just as excited, all right? But as we wrap up this segment of the podcast, we will finally end the show and get to the topic we've all been waiting for. The best NBA deadline deals in history are on the other side of this break. But until then, enjoy this quick break.
Are you looking for help for your fantasy football team? Check out the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. Get today's best advice on who to start, who to sit, even who you should draft. From sleeper picks to red-hot lineups, they got it all covered for you. That's gsmcpodcast.com/fantasy-football-podcast. We'll cover traditional leagues, dynasty, PPR, even IDP leagues. When you need fantasy help, there's just one show to hit up. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back, folks. Welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast. I am your host, Shaq Scott, and we have had a great action-packed show for you today. We started off the show with a bang, talking about March Madness Mania, the NCAA men and women's bracket. We talked about some of the key matchups that we saw, some of the names that stuck out, a couple of upsets, couple of not so quite upsets, blowout city. I gave you my predictions on what to expect this upcoming week. And then we dove into the world of the NBA and the trade deadline and how it was a very active NBA trade deadline this year, and not one active with just compensatory picks and future draft picks, but one that featured some actual names this year. We then talked about the NFL and how the San Francisco 49ers are positioning themselves for the future and why they're only not helping themselves, but also helping the New England Patriots. Shout out to Bill Belichick. Jimmy G may be on the way over to New England. Who knows? And then we are going to end today's show with talking about the best NBA deadline deals in history. And I've been teasing it all show long. I know you've been waiting. You may have fast forwarded to the end of this, but either way, I appreciate you listening. We are finally here, folks. We're going to talk about the best NBA deadline deals in history. And the reason why this idea was brought to me today, I was thinking about the NBA deadline, and I mentioned earlier how of a great day it was for me. And to be quite honest with you guys, I was active that day of the NBA deadline. I was out and I was moving, I was driving in a car, and I was out and about. But it was so much going on. Every time a deal happened, I had to stop. I stopped in my tracks and was checking Twitter and checking all these apps and making sure I was staying up to date. So it's a very big deal. Anytime the NBA trade deadline comes around, regardless if names actually are on the move or if they're not, it's a very big deal. And it always has been like that. And it got me to thinking, what are some of the big NBA trade deadline deals that happened in history? And so I did my research, did my digging, and I came up with a list. And this list is courtesy of theyardbarker.com. Yardbarker.com has the biggest NBA trade deadline deals of the last 20 years. And so to start things off, before we get into this list, I will let you know there are some names on here that are kind of dated. So if you may not recall who they are, I'll make sure to refresh your memory here, because I am a person who was an avid NBA fan amongst other sports, but I have been watching the NBA my whole entire life. So I'm a diehard NBA fan. I've been watching all these teams and these organizations, and a lot of these deals that went through had implications for years to come. So that's the cool thing about the NBA. We may see a trade happen in 2012, and draft picks may be attached to it that won't go into effect until 2016. So potentially a trade that happened between the Celtics and the Minnesota Timberwolves that involved players like Kevin Garnett back in the day could lead to potentially a Boston Celtic team drafting a Jason Tatum or drafting a Jaylen Brown. And those are things that have happened. And these type of trades have happened along in the midst of the trade deadline. So as we got the Yardbarker here's list up, we'll go through some of these best deals in history, and I'll let you know if I agree or disagree with some of these deals. And some of these deals, quite honestly, are news to me. You realize these people got traded, but you don't recall that these trades were going down in the midst of the NBA trade deadline. So the first deal they have on this list is the point guard swap between Stephon Marbury, Sam Cassell, and Terrell Brandon. So two of those names you may recognize, but Terrell Brandon, not so much, but that's okay. The big names in this story are Stephon Marbury and Sam Cassell. And if you don't recall, at the time, this deal happened in March 11th of 1999. And Stephon Marbury came out of New York, a very highly touted recruit, killed the New York high school circuit. All the NBA teams were drooling at the mouth over his potential. And he got drafted by the Minnesota Timberwolves and was paired with a young Kevin Garnett. So this at the time was thought to be a great 1-2 punch. But when it came down to the Minnesota Timberwolves having to decide what to do with their cap space, they decided to dedicate the cap space at the time to Kevin Garnett. And when they did that, they left Stephon Marbury on the outside looking in. So what did they do? They decided to trade Stephon Marbury, and he ended up getting traded to the New Jersey Nets. The New Jersey Nets, who are now the Brooklyn Nets at the time were the New Jersey Nets, and this deal ended up working out for all parties involved, especially Stephon Marbury, who went on to be NBA All-Star for the New Jersey Nets. So that's one of the deals they have on here. As I scroll through the list, we see Ron Artest being traded to the Indiana Pacers. Now, whenever I say Ron Artest and Pacers, the synonymous thing you think of is the Malice in the Palace. Now, yes, that is a part of Ron Artest's history, but Ron Artest was a very good player for the Indiana Pacers. When he was traded to the Indiana Pacers, he ended up becoming a Defensive Player of the Year and an All-Star, and a future All-Star for the Indiana Pacers. That Pacers team eventually got to the Eastern Conference Finals. This was back in 2004. All this was before the Malice of the Palace. But nonetheless, Ron Artest was a very key component on the Indiana Pacers team, but he was traded to the Indiana Pacers from the Chicago Bulls in the trade deadline. This happened on February 19th of 2002. Trade deadline deal right there. We have also on this list here the Celtics trading Joe Johnson. If you may recall, Joe Johnson is on the latter stages of his career. He had a cup of coffee with the Detroit Pistons last year before COVID shut the league down. But Joe Johnson was traded from the Boston Celtics as a rookie, which is a very strange thing to see, to the Phoenix Suns. You may be saying, why is that such a big deal? The Phoenix Suns, for fans who are not familiar, were a very, very, very ahead of its time team in the early 2000s. They were known for that quick 7-second offense. So a lot of the offense that we saw Golden State run through for their reign of 4 or 5 years in which they were reaching the NBA Finals, as a lot of it was the foundation and the groundwork for that was those Phoenix Suns teams. A lot of those Phoenix Suns teams had a lot of pieces and implementation of what the Golden State Warriors ended up becoming. But that 7-second offense led by Mike D'Antoni as a head coach was a quick shooting offense. Get the ball down the court, either a very quick three-pointer or a very efficient two-point field goal. Regardless of a make or miss, they're running the floor. And the key component to that team was Joe Johnson, who was traded on a trade deadline back in 2002, on February 20th, 2002. Ray Allen traded for Gary Payton. So in 2003, the Supersonics and Milwaukee Bucks, Seattle Supersonics, or rest in peace to the Seattle Supersonics, now the Oklahoma City Thunder, but the Seattle Supersonics traded Ray Allen to Seattle for Gary Payton. So that ended up being a huge deal for the Seattle Supersonics, as Ray Allen went on to be a monster for the Seattle Supersonics, along with others like Rashard Lewis. So now as I look through this list, there's some other big names that's sticking out. Let's see what else we got here. Let's pull out another big name. I see, this is a good one. Rasheed Wallace putting the Detroit Pistons over the top. So now I'm going to stop here. Rasheed Wallace. So for those of you unfamiliar with Rasheed Wallace, in 2004, Rasheed Wallace was a part of the Portland Trailblazers. He was having a hard time there. The Trailblazers were kind of on the verge of whether or not they were going to rebuild or hold on to some of their veteran pieces, kind of like where the Orlando Magic are right now. So they had very solid veteran players with Rasheed Wallace and Jermaine O'Neal's and a lot of pieces that were coming through, but they kind of were looking towards the future in Portland. So they decided to move on from Rasheed Wallace. And on the deadline, Rasheed Wallace, on February 9th, Rasheed Wallace ended up getting traded to the Atlanta Hawks, actually. And he only stayed with the Atlanta Hawks for one game. He played one game for the Atlanta Hawks before he was traded on the trade deadline day to the Detroit Pistons. So what was the significance of this trade, you may be asking? For those of you who don't recall, Rasheed Wallace was that last piece that the Detroit Pistons needed. Rasheed Wallace was a part of the Ben Wallace, the Chauncey Billups, the Richard Hamilton, the Tayshaun Prince NBA championship winning team that went on to knock off the Los Angeles Lakers. A Lakers team that had some pretty big names on it. You got the rest in peace Kobe Bryant, you had Shaquille O'Neal, you had Karl Malone, you had Gary Payton. You had some big names attached to this team. And they were taken down pretty handedly by the Detroit Pistons. But none of that could have happened without the help of Rasheed Wallace. And this trade went down on the trade deadline. Rasheed Wallace was a very integral part of that Detroit Pistons team. He was one of the very first, the 3-and-D type of stretch forward. So Rasheed Wallace, this is back in 2004. Now, you got to keep in mind that it wasn't very common that you were seeing a power forward step back and shoot the three if his name wasn't Dirk Nowitzki. But Rasheed Wallace added a three-pointer to his game at this time, and he was not afraid to take a step back and shoot a three-pointer. He ended up doing that for the Detroit Pistons, and that ended up paying off for them as they had an established big shot Chauncey Billups and Richard Hamilton, who was unstoppable in the mid-range at the time, and the defensive menace and Tayshaun Prince and Ben Wallace solidified this core by trading for Rasheed Wallace, ended up playing for the Detroit Pistons and eventually winning the NBA Finals. Now, Rasheed went on to play 5 more seasons for the Pistons, and they ended up going to another NBA Finals, didn't win that one, and they went to 2 All-Star games with the Pistons. But that's one of the most impactful NBA deadline deals in history. As we go through this list some more, I see the New Orleans Hornets at the time, not the Pelicans, New Orleans Hornets sending Baron Davis to the Golden State Warriors. So you may be saying, Baron Davis to the Warriors, why is this important? So at the time, Baron Davis was a part of the New Orleans Hornets. Baron Davis and the New Orleans Hornets got robbed by the Orlando Magic in the referees in the playoffs in the Eastern Conference by 3 that ended up winning, that should have won the game for the New Orleans Hornets at the time, but the replay said otherwise, or replay wasn't around at the time, and then said otherwise for the New Orleans Hornets eventually losing to the Orlando Magic. Tracy McGrady led Orlando Magic. And so New Orleans is kind of at their ends with Baron Davis, a very frustrated Baron Davis, and he's going back and forth with the ownership and the leadership there, and they're looking to move him. So when do they decide to move him? February 24th of 2005, Baron Davis, a very, very good and I believe low-key underrated point guard in history, was traded from the New Orleans Hornets to the Golden State Warriors, who ended up trading Speedy Claxton and Dale Davis. 2 decent NBA players, but in comparison to Baron Davis, no names, and a steal for the Golden State Warriors. This trade 2 years later ended up leading to the We Believe Warriors. And those of you who don't remember, the We Believe Warriors was the 8-seeded Golden State Warrior team that ended up beating the 2007 Dallas Mavericks. The number 1 overall seed in the NBA playoffs, Dallas Mavericks lost to the We Believe Warriors. And that was the same Warrior team that had Steven Jackson on it, Matt Barnes, and Don Nelson. And they had a lot of young guys who were part of that core that were willing to buy in to why not us, why not now mentality, and ended up shocking the Golden State Warriors and giving the Utah Jazz all they could handle in the NBA playoffs. That team ended up disbanding years later, but it's still impressive to say that on the trade deadline in 2005 that the Golden State Warriors, the We Believe Warriors, ended up getting Baron Davis for just Speedy Claxton and Dale Davis on the trade deadline. So that goes to show, you always have to pay attention to these trade deadline deals. You never know what they can turn into. Another one on this list here, we got Pau Gasol being traded to the Lakers for his brother Marc Gasol, and we know how that ended up turning out. Pau Gasol ended up being an eventual NBA champion with Kobe Bryant. This was Kobe Bryant's first NBA championship post Shaquille O'Neal. Everybody telling Kobe Bryant, it was a mistake for the Lakers to choose Kobe Bryant over Shaq. Kobe will never win a championship without Shaq. But he ended up teaming with Pau Gasol and the rest was history as he ended up beating the Orlando Magic for the NBA Finals. In the NBA Finals, a pretty good Orlando Magic team, if I might add. Another NBA trade deadline deal. We got Shaq going to those 7-second Suns that I mentioned. So I mentioned a little bit earlier how the Phoenix Suns traded for Joe Johnson as the starting piece and a foundation piece for the new look Phoenix Suns. They also had Goran Dragic on that team, but ended up trading for Shaquille O'Neal as well. You know, Shaq was a part of the Miami Heat in 2006, the NBA Final Championship winning Miami Heat. And the Phoenix Suns were in the market for a big man that they believed they could bring in. Now, this trade ended up not working out in the long run for the Phoenix Suns, but they did pull the trigger and trade for Shaquille O'Neal, which is a huge name if you look back in history to see that Shaq got traded during the NBA trade deadline in 2008. You know, during that trade, Sean Marion, who was very upset with the Phoenix Suns at the time, ended up going to the Heat for Shaq, who was a little bit past his prime, but still a pretty big name to see on the trade deadline. Another one that we have on this list, Jason Kidd going to the Dallas Mavericks. So in 2008, Jason Kidd got traded from the Nets back to the team that originally drafted him in the Dallas Mavericks. You know, in that trade, the Nets got some first-round picks. Devin Harris, Keith Van Horn ended up retiring. And they ended up getting the Mavericks ended up getting Jason Kidd. And we know history tells us that ended up being an impressive trade because the Mavericks, Jason Kidd was a part of the Mavericks team that was able to knock off that not 1, not 2, not 3, not 4, not 5, not 6, LeBron James, Dwayne Wade, and Chris Bosh Miami Heat NBA Finals team in 2011. An NBA Finals team in which we saw the Dallas Mavericks run a zone defense and completely watch the Miami Heat short circuit, and the Mavericks ended up pulling the upset and winning the NBA Finals. Jason Kidd was a part of that team, and he would not have been a part of that team if it not had been for the 2008 NBA trade deadline deal. Now, this next one on this list is a pretty big name that I believe, to me, is one of the biggest trade deadline deals that we ever have in history. And I'm going to give you a second here as you're sitting in your cars or however you may be listening to try to think where I'm going with this. I'll give you a hint. This player is still in the NBA today. He just recently passed Hakeem Olajuwon on the all-time scoring list. He's still killing people with the same set of moves that he's been doing for all these years. And at the time, he kind of was frowned upon for forcing this trade upon the organization. All right, enough of your guessing. The player that I'm referring to is Carmelo Anthony. He's ended up forcing his way from the Denver Nuggets to the New York Knicks. So on February 22nd of 2011, Carmelo Anthony, who was an unrestricted free agent in the offseason, forced his way to the New York Knicks. The move was from on Carmelo Anthony's standards. You know, he was always planning to sign with the New York Knicks, but he was telling the Denver Nuggets ahead of the time, like, look, I'm not going to re-sign with you guys. So you can either A, get rid of me now, or B, wait till the offseason to trade me. I mean, wait till the offseason in which I'm just going to up and leave, and you're going to leave shorthanded. I'm going to walk over to New York, talk to them, sign with them, and be happy. So he ended up forcing his way out of Denver, ended up getting traded to New York. And now a lot have their personal opinions about this, whether this was a successful move for Carmelo Anthony or for the Denver Nuggets. But in the end, I do believe it to be successful. You know, not every player in the NBA is after the chase of the NBA championship. And some just are after the happiness. And Carmelo Anthony clearly wanted to play in New York. He clearly wanted to play New York, you know. He wanted to play in New York. He got his opportunity. He threw a fuss, and he got what he wanted. And eventually that led to Carmelo Anthony having a pretty decent career in New York, and eventually still having that career going right now in Portland. So shout out to Carmelo Anthony. We'll go through a couple more trades here before we wrap up the show. And as I'm going through this list, a couple of names are sticking out, and this one I've been waiting to get to, because this is a trade that we talked about. I talked about the idea of future implications. You not knowing what these trades can eventually turn into. So on March 13th of 2012, the Golden State Warriors traded Monte Ellis to the Milwaukee Bucks for Andrew Bogut. So you may be saying, why is that such a big deal? Well, at the time, the Milwaukee Bucks owner was obsessed with the idea of Monte Ellis. And the Milwaukee Bucks had the idea of either trading, when they traded Andrew Bogut, they could have, when they traded for Andrew Bogut, they had the opportunity to either A, get Monte Ellis or Steph Curry. And you won't believe who the Milwaukee Bucks picked at the time. Monte Ellis. The Milwaukee Bucks chose Monte Ellis over Steph Curry. And I bet if we were to ask him to this day, who would he have chosen? Would he still have gone with that? He may probably get upset for us asking that question. But the Bucks traded for Monte Ellis over Steph Curry, which ended up launching the Warriors dynasty. And the reason I say it launched the Warriors dynasty, because at that point the Warriors were all in on the young core that they had. So they had Steph Curry, who at the time was in Monte Ellis' shadow, and it kind of was both of their teams, but by the Bucks trading for Monte Ellis, that put the spotlight on Mark Jackson, who was the head coach at the time, and then Steph Curry and then David Lees, and they say, all right, you got these guys here. What are you going to do with them? Which eventually turned into the Draymond Greens and the Klay Thompsons, and we know how that turned out. But it's just interesting to see that how a deal that some may think of, well, that doesn't really have any big names in it, doesn't have really implications into it, could end up changing the course of history for NBA teams to come, And that just goes to show you never know, and why you should always tune in to the NBA trade deadline. Speaking of tuning in, I thank you guys for tuning in to this week's episode. We appreciate you for listening, for liking, subscribing, however you may be listening. But again, guys, we thank you for listening to the GSMC Sport Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I would just like to remind you guys to please remember to subscribe to the show, write a nice review. That really helps us out. If you can give the show a follow on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We are very active on all of our social media platforms. We will be staying up to date on the latest of the news when it comes to social media. If you are a follower of us, you can feel free to engage. You can reference things that you heard in the show, things that you may see going on in the sports world, or a couple of topics you may want covered on the next show. We'll be sure to get on it. But we can't do any of that without you following us, and we can't do any of this without you listening. So we appreciate you for listening and subscribing and just enjoying the show, man. We got much more to come for you, and we got a big week ahead of us, to say the least, with sports, when we got the NCAA tournament, Elite 8 matchups coming up, and we got some football news, we got the NBA. We got it all coming for you. We just thank you guys for listening, and we can't wait to get into another edition of the GSMC Sports Podcast. But until next time, we are out. See ya.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.